Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. I want to thank our police chief, Tom Quinlan, and all the reporters that have joined us this morning for the briefing. It has been a tough, emotional, painful few days for our great city. We have all heard the anger and frustration in the voices of our neighbors, and we feel it too. I know that this past weekend brought incidents from the Columbus Division of Police that did not meet my or the community's expectations for professionalism and protection. We fell short on protecting public safety while allowing peaceful protests. The goal must be to do both, not one over the other. As you all know, in February, I laid out an equity agenda, an agenda that calls out racism and discrimination where it exists, and my plans to address it. I am committed to that agenda. We cannot fully engage in the agenda until we acknowledge the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others that should be alive today but are not. Until we address the racism and discrimination that is marring community police relations. As we move through the next days and weeks, you can expect clear, tangible actions regarding policing and accounting of what we've implemented from the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission and the Matrix report, and a time frame for additional actions that will be taken swiftly. As I have said, I fully support the creation of a civilian review board that works for Columbus, and it will be my top priority in our contract negotiations with the FOP later this year. I know all of you want to hear from Chief Quinlan, and I'm grateful for his work, his commitment to adjusting and changing the way we police, and how we protect peaceful protesters. Our goal as a city is to provide the balance between public safety and peaceful protests. We do not want to stifle or suppress. I don't want that, and I know our chief doesn't want that either. I'd now like to ask the chief to give us updates, and then we'll open it up to questions from the press. Chief?
Thank you, Mayor, and let me begin by saying that all of our hearts go out to the George Floyd's family, and this is a clear example of how bad policing tactics can land in tragic results. And we have a commitment to our community to make sure we get things right and hold people accountable when they do not. And that's occurring in this situation in Minneapolis. They are taking the right action, and I support that action. For an update on what's going on here in our community, we have a lot of good people that have, for not just recent events in Minneapolis or elsewhere in the country, but years of pain and a feeling of a lack of equity in treatment. And we have always been open to changing our practice and policies. We continually review them and try to update them. But again, we need the input from the community to help us guide our policies and our tactics that go beyond just what the law allows. We can be more restrictive than what the law allows. We need to know what the community expects from police, and that happens through constructive dialogue. And in this case, sometimes constructive protest. And we support the people in our community who want change. We will walk with them, and we will make those changes as the mayor has laid out. And I am committed to that. We do still have other people in our community that don't share the same values as people who want change. They're not committed to the same goals that we share with our community. In fact, they're destructive, they're dangerous, they're putting the good people of our community who want to be heard in danger, and they're putting police officers in danger. I can't expect my officers to go out there and protect the public if I don't take actions to try to protect officers. That I expect that of them, they expect that of me. So we're in this together. We have a shared common goal. We all want to be safe, and that's what I'm committed to. So over the last 24 hours, we've seen changes in how police are interacting with the public and how the public's interacting with the police. And that's the Pelian principle that goes back hundreds of years, and it's working still today. We're listening, and we have good progress being made. We still just need to work on some fringe elements that don't reflect our community. And we're going to do that and keep people safe and continue to march and facilitate the movements around Columbus for the good people who want to be heard. And we've had maybe, I think it was 10 or 11, I think it was 11 arrests last night, mostly for curfew related violations. We did not have any hands-on type of use of force, but officers again were pelted with frozen water bottles and rocks and bricks and other things that put not just the officers in danger, but watching the video, these were occurring where there were people's cars and people in cars and students up around Ohio State University in harm's way by the actions of these individuals. In fact, one Good Samaritan tried to give people a ride out of the area of Lane and High, and only to be robbed by those individuals and assaulted, violently assaulted. And we did catch those individuals. After a car chase and after a foot pursuit, we were able to catch them. I'm sorry, we caught a few that were with them, but there are some that are still out. So again, we want to protect people that are engaged in these type of activities legitimately, and protect them from people just like this who are not here with the shared goals that we all have. And with that, I think the progress we're seeing, the relations we're building, we're overdue. And with that, I'm ready to take some questions.
Thank you, Chief. And before we open it up to questions, I think something that the Chief said that I'll reinforce here, that the biggest change that we've seen over the last couple of days is having both peaceful protesters and the police working together to keep our officers safe and those peaceful protesters safe, and really working together to start to separate those folks that are in our community that have come from outside to destroy our community, to commit violence, to attack our officers. And I think there's great progress that's being made there because our officers and these peaceful protesters are working together to try to separate this fringe element that is here only for one reason, and that is to endanger people's lives and to destroy property. And we will not tolerate that. Now I'll open it up to questions. If you have a question, please go to the podium one at a time, and we'll respond directly. The Chief and I will be able to see you there in chambers.
Good afternoon. I'm Danielle Grossman, NBC4. So, Mayor Ginther, I have a question for you. You posted that you're asking people to submit some complaints of excessive force that have been happening over the past few days, and I have some questions about that independent review board. How exactly is that going to happen? Who's chosen for that review board?
So we did set up a separate line of for police complaints. We want to see all the instances when the police acted inappropriately. I know some people don't feel comfortable going through the chain of command through a traditional complaint through the IA, Internal Affairs. So we set up an email address where folks can send videos, photos, and details of the complaints that can be reviewed by civilians outside of police. And a team in the Public Safety Director's office will be responding. It'll be made up of an assistant director, a deputy director. We also are going to have a faith leader that's going to be part of that group, and there may be others as well. We've received more than 375 photos or complaints thus far into the email address. We're going to investigate each and every one of them, And the Internal Affairs Bureau has received already more than 80 complaints, and that was, I think, before this new way of reporting complaints was put out yesterday.
Hi, Mayor. Hi, Chief. This is Nick Evans with WOSU News. Last night, Chief, you talked about an advisory panel that you wanted to put in place to sort of be a bridge until we get to the Civilian Review Board. You guys have also talked a number of times about outside elements, but we haven't seen any specifics with this. I know I've requested the planning documents related to the Chief's advisory panel. I haven't heard back about that. You guys have also, talked about people from outside, but we haven't seen those arrest records yet. Can you, be more explicit about what these changes are that you're talking about to the way that we do policing? And also, are you going to release records related to the arrest so that we can actually have something explicit when you say in these sort of general terms, like, here are the changes we want to make. These are these outside elements that are causing the problems that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding the arrest records, we're going to turn those into a PDF and place them online, so you will see, since they are charged suspects, as long as they're adults, we will put that out so you can see the individuals that were charged. We have the race of the individual, the sex of the individual, and the zip code. So you'll be able to see that information and follow up on that, what the charges were. And on the Chief's Advisory Panel, what I'm looking to do is create an outlet for a conversation between myself and the community. And the important part of this is I don't want to have a direct influence on who the people are that are on this panel. I want members of City Council, who are your elected representatives, and the mayor to make selections. And the way I've laid it out, and this is all in draft form, this is all something we'll work out. As I envision it, would be 12 members. If you get too many, it's too hard to have detailed conversations. So we want to keep it where there can be, everyone can have meaningful input. So I want to have those 12 individuals selected by your elected representatives that meet with me monthly, and I have no qualifications on whether it's maybe a person is a convicted felon. That's fine, as long as there's no active warrants. Anyone in the community that the mayor or the city council select, they will be able to meet with me and discuss what is occurring in the community. I can share body camera footage with them. I can share some administrative investigation reports with them, or whatever they want, and I can share some criminal information that I can share that won't disrupt the ongoing investigation, because again, it's still important for the citizen to have due process. I don't want to disturb that, but all this information will be available, and because it's a Chief's Advisory Panel, they can have access to stuff that we may not be able to put out online, but they can look at how the police responded to this situation, what the decisions were, the charging decisions, how we reached this charge over that charge, how we used force or used different tactics to make apprehensions. And they can advise me, because I'm the one who can set policy for the division, and they have a direct line to me to say, this is not how the community wants the police to engage in for a violation. Let me just use a simple example of jaywalking as an example. We don't want someone that's jaywalking to be arrested the same way somebody is charged with a capital offense, clearly. So they can talk to me and say, can we make adjustments? Where can we legally, medically, and tactically make safe changes to policy that's going to keep everybody safe and reduce the opportunities to have bad occurrences like we saw in other places in the country? And so that's the idea behind it. It's going to be forward-looking. It's going to be able to change policy going forward, and I look forward to those conversations. I think we'll build better bridges having that community input directly between me and the community, with oversight from the mayor and the city council.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Chief. This is Ori Givens from Spectrum News 1. I'm going to ask about the use of force over the past 5 days. The videos and the pictures that we've seen, obviously there are snapshots and what happened, but there were methods that were used against people in Central Ohio that the public doesn't agree with. There's a petition where thousands say that you both should be removed because of what happened over the weekend. How are you going to make sure that people in this city can trust the police and their elected officials to protect them and not subject them to things like gas or whatever other projectiles were deployed this weekend to suppress protest?
I very much appreciate the question, and you're absolutely correct, and that's why I spoke with the chief over the weekend, and as the mayor, I take responsibility for what happens with our division of police. Is my responsibility, and I acknowledge we made mistakes in the way that we engaged, particularly on Saturday, and had a conversation with the chief after seeing many pictures and videos and talking to people personally that we all know and trust and work well together with in the community that were there for peaceful protests. I shared that information and let the chief know that our actions didn't meet the community's expectations or mine. And he immediately understood, acknowledged, and changed the way that we have engaged peaceful protesters since then. And I think he's gone a long way having our division of police, the men and women that are out on the streets every day, understand there are two very distinct groups that are out there right now. Overwhelmingly, peaceful protesters that we need to protect and make sure that we have positive engagement and interaction with them. And then there is this criminal element that's interested in hurting our police officers, burning down our buildings, and destroying our quality of life. And it's our job to make sure that we understand clearly there are two different types. And I think the adjustments the chief has made, the changes that he has made, having Governor DeWine's support, bringing in the National Guard, having the regional law enforcement support that we've had, we have been able to make some significant changes in the way that we've engaged the public and worked with peaceful protesters together so that we could focus on and go after this criminal element that was putting our officers, putting protesters and the public at risk. Chief?
Thank you, Mayor. Let me pick up on what the mayor said. He said we didn't meet expectations. And so I want to build on that because that's exactly what we're focused on. And as Mayor said, there's two distinct groups in our community. Well, there's also two distinct pressures or rules that drive police actions. One of them is a legal standard. Graham versus Connor is the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that determines how and when police may use force. And that's what we typically train to and operate by. The missing piece of that is what the community expectations are for how we exercise our force policies under Graham versus Connor. We can't be more lenient than what the Supreme Court says, but we can be more restrictive. And so that's where the community expectations come in and where we make better informed decisions on training and policy once we hear from the community and find out what the community standard is so we can live up to the expectations.
And to be very specific and direct to the question, the advisory group that I will work with the council president in making a top priority and having that formed hopefully within the next week or two to work with the chief, I would expect that the top priorities would be reviewing use of force policies and how we interact with peaceful protesters. Obviously, I think there's a wide consensus out there in the community about how we handle people who are here to hurt our officers, to destroy our property and burn down our city. But how we engage peaceful protesters and our use of force policies will be top priorities for this group once they come together and start working with the chief. The chief is absolutely right. We have minimum standards in place with this case law and precedent. But Columbus's expectations are of a 21st century community policing engagement strategy that Chief Quinlan was hired to implement and do based on the matrix recommendations, the Safety Advisory Commission recommendations, and his vision of community policing in a 21st century model. We no longer are going to be a department that operates on minimum standards, but meeting and exceeding community expectations.
Hi, my name is Danae King. I'm the religion reporter at the Columbus Dispatch. And I know that the mayor and public safety and the police department have been working with faith leaders for at least 2 years now on some alleged internal racism against officers in the division. And so I'm curious, you know, pastors have said recently that that progress has been made, but it's been kind of slow, and there's been some resistance to things like pairing citizens from an officer's precinct with them to train and expand understanding. So, you know, I'm curious about, you know, how that's going and what's being done to solve the problem of kind of this idea of maybe internal racism against officers within the division.
Thank you for the question, and you're absolutely right. In the Matrix report, talked about this. There's a huge disparity between what our officers of color, women, LGBTQ officers face with respect to discrimination and racism, what they're seeing day in and day out, both interactions within the division and how things are being carried out with the public. We acknowledge that. Racism and discrimination exists. It exists in the Division of Police. It exists in city government. It exists in your newsroom. And it exists in places throughout this community. Our job is to acknowledge it exists and own the remedy to address it. And that is exactly what the chief is doing with the reforms and the changes that he is making. My understanding actually with this group that I think it's Faith in Public Action or Faith in Public Life group that's been working with the chief and the director is that significant progress has been made. One of the things they asked for was an assistant director in the safety director's office to focus specifically on EEO complaints. We now have that director doing that, and folks have been coming both in police and fire with complaints. They hadn't had an opportunity to go outside the chain of command for those issues in the past, and so that has been great progress. And I had heard just recently from many of the pastors involved with that work that they were very happy with the progress that the chief was making. So I'll let him speak a little bit more to the engagement with Faith in Public Life.
Thank you, Mayor. Exactly what I have done is worked with them and met their 7 obligations and outlined exactly where we are at today, where we were when we started these conversations, and where we're heading. It would be foolish for me to suggest that racism does not exist in the Division of Police, because I have departmentally charged people for racism. I've held people accountable, and I've made it very clear that I will not tolerate it, and that you will not come before me and get a written reprimand or leave forfeiture if you engage in an EEO violation, whether it be racism or gender discrimination or retaliation, anything. You will go before the Director of Public Safety to face a suspension or termination. That's my commitment, and that's what I've upheld. So I can't say it doesn't exist, because I have charged people for that in the Division of Police, and will continue to root that out. And that's been pretty well received by the faith leaders, and I continue to uphold that commitment.
Good afternoon, Mayor, or good morning, I suppose, still. Mayor and Chief, Jeff Reddick from ABC 6 News. Wanted to ask, we have reporters in court this morning. It's been indicated that potentially one person arrested at the recent protests on a gun charge, I believe, may have tested positive for COVID-19. Certainly, that's a risk among the crowds that have gathered as well during the past 5, now potentially 6 days. Is there any thought of trying to disband these, not only on the basis of the potential violence and destruction that comes along, but also on the basis of the current pandemic that we're facing?
The question, Jeff, and it came up yesterday at a press conference with Councilmember Tyson and Dr. Roberts. A reporter asked about these protests and the issue of clearly Folks are not following social distancing. I participated in a couple of protests and we didn't practice social distancing, but it's critically important that people have the ability to raise their voice, their anger, their frustration, and call for change. So what I've attempted to do, and I've seen a number of folks wearing facial coverings and masks that are protesting. And so what I've tried to do when I participated in protests is lead by example and do my very best to try to keep distance and wear a facial covering and mask. But Dr. Roberts was very clear yesterday in the press briefing. There is a risk, not just for here, but in big cities across the country where these peaceful protests are taking place, that the spread obviously is a real threat. And we already have the highest number of cases in the state. So we are preparing for the impact. And Dr. Roberts and I will be unveiling in the next week or so a very extensive and aggressive community testing strategy, as well as our plan for contact tracing and investigations, which are going to be absolutely critical until, with social distancing and facial coverings, until we have a vaccine. But Chief, if you want to speak to the specific case, if you have any information about that.
Thank you, Mayor. I was informed this morning that there was a report of a person under arrest in court this morning that had tested positive, and I have my public information officer trying to verify that through the health department by name. So until I get that information, I'm not able to confirm it. But it does go back to overall concerns. We are still in a global pandemic. We still need to hear from people, but the concern is not only are people at risk because of the pandemic and COVID or the coronavirus, but they're also officers at risk because there is no way for any of us out there in this situation to provide the safety that we need, and we've been practicing for so many months and made such good progress. I don't want to see this unwind that progress. So we need to find a way to listen and make change and still keep people safe. That's always our goal. And I'm concerned that with the exposure officers have, that we could see more of a surge, which will also take officers, put them in quarantine, and create a handicap on us to be able to continue to provide the level of service that we are. So as people protest, as people come downtown and have their voices heard, just please keep in mind that there are continuing risks, and officers are very, I'm very proud of the fact that they're going out there despite the risk and putting themselves in danger as they do for everything and keep the public safe.
Would you be able to, as a follow-up, Chief, would you be able to describe what you know about the student journalists that reported and had video of themselves being maced near the campus area last night, and why that may have occurred?
Sent the incident to Internal Affairs to have it investigated so we can find out what the facts are, because again, if that occurred, then we need to fix it. If there's more to the story than a single video or a single snapshot, which I've seen some videos from other angles that give new perspective to it, then I think the officers also deserve a full investigation and review of what happened to either hold them accountable or show that they acted appropriately. In this case, the curfew was not the issue. The issue was when you see reporters at a crime scene, they're behind scene tape. They don't go inside the crime scene. When police are creating a police line and directing people to move, reporters are able to stand there and film and do anywhere where the public's allowed to be. But when we're moving people out, because at that time you can see in the videos actively bottles and rocks and projectiles coming at officers and the public, for their safety we had to move people along. That's all they were asked to do, is you can't stay here, you have to move. Didn't have to, we would not arrest them for curfew violation. Those are applied to other people. Media is exempt. But sometimes also with media personalities, we recognize them visibly. They're either wearing their polo shirt or something, we recognize them from TV or from interaction we've had with them. In this case, an officer certainly didn't recognize them. They're trying to identify themselves and use their media credentials. And again, when things are happening really fast and you're getting pelted with bottles and rocks, we're dealing with imperfect human beings in imperfect situations. Mistakes will happen, and we will take action to correct them and make sure that we do not allow our mistakes to be repeated.
Megan Henry with the Columbus Dispatch here. Given that the violence last night started after police began using pepper spray and other means of crowd control to disperse protesters past curfew, why continue to use those methods and not other methods to prevent altercations with protesters like we saw last night on campus?
Chief, you want to respond?
Absolutely. I do not have information that those tactics were used while there were peaceful protests going on. The information I have is that was a response to a violent crowd looking to continue further damage to our city and further injure our officers. And officers have a right to protect themselves, protect the public, and these are means we use for crowd dispersals that do not place hands on people and do not have the ugliness of a tug of war or anything else that you would see when you have to physically remove somebody. So, excuse me. So, it's my understanding that this was a response to criminal activity and assaults towards police officers and the community, not provocation of that to occur.
And if you have any evidence or information that you could share with the chief or Sergeant Fuqua, we can get you a response or answer if you're talking about a separate incident from Lane and High. Yes.
Hello, Haley Colombo from Columbus Business First. Mayor, you mentioned there are distinct groups of people who are causing property damage and those who are peacefully protesting or members of the media. Chief, you just said that when things are happening really fast, it can be hard to tell, like you just mentioned in the case with the student journalist. What do you say to those who are criticizing that you are not adequately distinguishing between those groups? As well, the mayor said that there were 100 cases of property damage as of Saturday. Where does that number stand now?
Chief?
The last numbers I saw were still just slightly over 100. I'm getting a report prepared for me every day, and I have not had the report forwarded to me this morning because of other activities I've been preparing for. However, on the student activities and trying to identify people, now keep in mind, this is very visible and people know who we are. But there's other officers out there that are in plainclothes, for instance. You won't readily identify, they're not readily identifiable. When you have a crowd of people wearing bulky clothes and just maybe have a lanyard on, and officers are, their attention's being drawn in 100 different directions, sometimes, again, imperfect human beings in imperfect situations, it's difficult. It's not, there's no malice involved, there's no intent. It's just a very chaotic situation. And in that regard, I'd ask the public to have some patience and please comply, and we'll work it out afterwards. But please don't stand there and argue. Move along and comply, and we'll fix this after the fact so there's nothing bad happens.
You know, I've been to a number of the businesses that have been damaged, spoke to business owners and going to visit some others here today. A lot of these small businesses had been closed for several months. We're just starting to reopen post-COVID, and it will create significant challenges. There will be some small businesses that do not come back. There has been significant property damage. We don't have evidence to directly link it, but we have a strong feeling that the fire, massive damage of a new development on Topiary Park was conducted by this nefarious, dangerous criminal element that we've spoken to, who is trying to hijack this movement of peaceful protesters to put officers at rest, the public at risk, and to burn our city down. That was a $28 million development. So these are real impacts that are going to create additional job losses and negative economic impact. And so as proud as we are to welcome and protect and encourage public protests, you know, that are peaceful, we have to be laser focused on this criminal element who's putting our officers, our neighbors, and our businesses at risk. And that's what this continued work. I will say that this is the first time we have seen as a community, and certainly our division of police, the types of ongoing protests over an extended period of time where nationally we've seen this. These fringe element criminal groups have attempted to hide and hijack peaceful protests. And so it is challenging to know that there are criminals amongst these peaceful protesters who seek to hurt our officers, our neighbors, and our city. And we're doing our very best. And when we make mistakes, we will acknowledge them and we will improve upon them. Because the ability to peacefully protest is at the heart and core of our country and our values as a community.
Mayor, Chief, this is Nick Evans from WOSU again. First of all, thank you for giving us so much time. I really do appreciate it. You guys have a number of times so far said that there are two different elements that are involved here, but the thing is, tear gas doesn't discriminate. So, is that really the best tactic for end-of-night policing? If you want to, distinguish between people, tear gas isn't going to do it. Is arrest the better move? And then also, Chief, I understand this is two questions at once. I apologize, but we saw images yesterday, early on in the evening, of you and other leadership officers milling with the crowd. But then at the end of the night, for the second night in a row, we saw, the curfew enforced with tear gas and pepper spray. So what do you say to residents who see that first show of support as disingenuous? Thank you.
Well, the issue of dealing with peaceful protesters, as you saw yesterday in the downtown area, was a welcome relief. And we've been able to start building bridges and get on a path to this remedy that is so overdue. What you saw in the campus area were people who were not downtown peacefully protesting, but were up throwing balls and rocks and getting ready to create more damage in our university area. We had to take some action to distinguish between those who we want to walk with and want to work with and want to hear from, and those that are here just to either create havoc or force some other agenda on the city that has nothing to do with what the real heart of this is about: racism and public servants. The use of chemical agents and other munitions that are used to disperse crowds is not discriminate. They saturate an area, and that's the way these items work. Because our goal is not to have to go put our hands on people, make physical arrests, take people's civil rights away, which we have the authority to do, to take their freedom away, but that's not our goal. We want them to leave the area and disperse. That's the idea of the agents we're using, is to get people to move, not to have to then take people, put a criminal charge on them, have that on their record, have to go to court, have to hire an attorney. We just want them to leave and stop damaging our city.
And again, what I'd reinforce that the chief has shared, that the engagement you saw from the chief and deputy chief were with peaceful protesters, and the use of tear gas and other chemical agents were used to deal with a criminal element that, again, is trying to hijack peaceful protests in this movement. And that was the action that was taken by officers at Lane and High last evening. There is a difference, and we're going to continue to have to remain focused on treating these two very different groups. Overwhelming majority of peaceful protesters and a very small element of criminals.
Mr. Mayor, Chief, Ori Givens from Spectrum News again. I want to focus back on the contract negotiations that are supposed to happen regarding the police department, the police unions. I'm curious to know how much of these new strategies, whether from the matrix recommendations or from the Community's Safety Council, will make it into the actual new contracts that that are going to be agreed on between the city and the police. And then two, specifically within the contract that exists now, police the records for disciplinary actions, complaints, things like that, I believe have a time frame where after that time frame they are removed from the record. Would the city explore making that time frame either longer or eliminating it altogether so we can have a record of the actions of police who may be some of those quote-unquote bad apples?
Excellent questions, and absolutely. There are a number of things that the chief has already implemented from the Matrix report and the Safety Advisory Commission. We're going to be bringing the commissioners together to give them an update on that work, I think later this week or early next week, so the chief can lay out all the work that he has already done. There are a few that will require engagement and contract negotiations, but I have been very, very clear. I agree with the council president that a civilian review board will be the city's top priority in this round of negotiations. But as the chief has already shared, he is forming an advisory group right now on policy. And he can change policy of the division and how we engage, when we use force, how we engage peaceful protests, all those types of things. And I want to get that group formed immediately. Because we want to make sure that the policies we have in place meet community expectations, not minimum legal standards. And that's what the chief has outlined here today that we are committed to do. And we know that expectations of the community will change over time. And our job is not to police based on minimum legal standards, but meeting and exceeding community expectations. So this will be an ongoing piece of work to make sure that everybody in our community feels served and protected as opposed to policed. And the other question, I'm trying.
That remove records after a certain period of time, disciplinary records?
Progress on that. That was one of our priorities. I think in the last round of negotiations, there were some changes made to extending the time in which complaints could be filed. And I agree with you. I think that we need to have a longer period of time for things to stay in people's records. Most people that work, things stay in their file and are part of their record for a good part of their career. The other thing that the chief is working on is having an early intervention system in place for officers who may not be able to bring their very best to work because of things going on in their personal lives, or over time have continued to have complaints or issues raised about their conduct or engagement with the public. And so he's continuing to work on putting that together. And then obviously, we're very interested in the way the chief has made changes to make sure that our officers are getting the support they need, with mental health and wellness and other things. We know our officers can't bring their very best to work, whether in the midst of a crisis like this or in their day-to-day work serving the public, unless we're taking care of them and making their health and wellness, not just physical, but mental health and professional development, a top priority as a city. Chief?
Oh, I'll add to that is I'm management, and I'm on the mayor's team, and any expansion of management rights are very welcome to me.
Hey, King with the Columbus Dispatch again. I'm curious, I noticed, Chief Quinlan, that you walked with protesters and Deputy Chief Knight last night, and I'm curious kind of what changed between Sunday at midnight and yesterday evening, and why the decision to walk at all, and also why the decision to do it last night.
Thank you for your questions. Excellent question. This was part of our intention all along. We always wanted to get out and engage. The level of activity and the violence that was going on, we wanted to make sure that our presence there, the chief brings more people around because they want to have that conversation, but we didn't want to create a condition where more people were in jeopardy because of people that were there to do criminal acts. So we had to get that tamped down and get procedures and tactics in place. We're going to keep people safe to facilitate a safe walk for the community. Officers, as you see clearly, put themselves in danger and stand between the risk from the criminal element to the public, but we don't want to create risk for the public.
Ted Hart from NBC4. During the pandemic, Mr. Mayor, we talked about how tax collections, tax revenue was down. The city is already suffering economically as a result of the pandemic. And we know these businesses, a lot of these businesses have been closed for weeks and now are going to be closed again for some time because of the damage. Could you talk about the economic toll of all of this on the city, as well as the toll on the city's image, and some sense of perhaps the long-term damage done here to the city?
Great question, Ted. I don't know if I have complete and accurate answers to give you, but I'll give you the best of what I got right now. Clearly, we knew before this crisis that revenue was going to be down, which is all the more reason why we put aside, money in our rainy day fund, our basic city services fund, our workers' comp rebate, as well as not spending nearly $20 million that had been budgeted for this year. Got all of our departments to really prioritize and focus, and so we've been able to realize a savings of an additional $20 million through that work. Obviously, there's going to be significant costs for law enforcement, for public service, for public health, dealing with this crisis, but also in response to COVID-19. We are very fortunate that we received $157 million as part of the CARES Act. And Senators Portman and Brown have worked very hard with Secretary Mnuchin and folks in Washington to provide additional flexibility on how those resources can be spent in our COVID-19 response. I would say that I think, we are entering a time now where if we continue to focus on racism and discrimination and take concrete action steps moving forward, that we will be able to move out of this crisis and fully focus on fighting the global pandemic that still threatens so many of our neighbors. And I think that's exactly what the people of Columbus are looking for, to speak out to the injustice, to say the names of these individuals who have died in the hands of law enforcement, who would be alive today had that not happened. Call it what it is and change it. Own the remedy and own the change. And that way we can move forward to devote most of our attention after we do this work to fighting the global pandemic. Dr. Roberts and her team and many other folks are completely focused on our response to COVID-19. As I said, we'll be rolling out our very aggressive community testing strategy and contact tracing and investigations effort. To speak to your other question about the long-term impact of Columbus, I think we're continuing to see the Columbus way, believe it or not. Even in this crisis, the way law enforcement is now, they've changed their engagement and approach with peaceful protesters. You now have peaceful protesters calling out and sharing information about criminal elements to police because they know they're a threat to this movement and the work that we're all focused on moving forward. You've got leaders in the community. They're going to be sharing an action plan later today for not just the city government, but the state government, the federal government, for the private sector, for nonprofits, that calls us to account to take action to fight racism and discrimination and inequity. So you're seeing elements of that, and I think that that is what will guide us through this crisis, fighting the global pandemic, and putting us on a road to recovery. But we can't get there until we do this very difficult work right now.
Kevin Landers, WBNS 10 TV. Thank you, Mayor, for this opportunity to talk with you today. Can you talk about the issue of people in our community have questioned both you and the chief's leadership and asked for both of you to resign? Can you talk about that and your feelings about that? And secondly, Mayor, did you ever give the chief an order, not to arrest unruly protesters or not to use mace during these protests? And for the chief, there are people in our community, African-American people in our community especially, who fear that when their children leave the house every night, go drive to meet friends or what have you, that they fear that they're going to be stopped by police. And I'm wondering if you're aware of that issue, that concern, and how, moving forward, can we change that perception so that they don't feel that way? Thank you.
3 questions, is that right? The first question, I'll leave the third question for the chief. It was on resignations, direct orders on arrests, and then safety for African American children and parents. Okay. To the first question, you know, the chief and I are in very high profile leadership positions. We're criticized every day, and we accept that criticism. That's part of the role of leadership and accountability. We accept that. We acknowledge when we make mistakes, and we change. And that's the cost of and the price of leadership. We believe passionately in fighting racism and discrimination. We believe in reform, and that's what we're committed to, and that is what our plan is. So I accept the criticism. That is part of being the mayor of the 14th largest city in America. And whether or not we're in a crisis or fighting a global pandemic, or none of those things, criticism comes my way every day, and I accept it. I learn from it, and when I make mistakes, I acknowledge them and move on. The second part, no, there were never direct orders to the chief on tactics. I shared with him on Sunday morning that our response and engagement, the way that we dealt with peaceful protesters, specifically on Saturday and Saturday morning, early afternoon, didn't meet my expectations and the community's expectations. He heard me out, he understood it, and he changed the strategy, the approach, and the tactics, but there have never been any direct orders of tactics or anything else other than me sharing feedback on what I was hearing from a lot of very active and engaged peaceful protesters that wanted to do their part to make sure that the protesters stayed safe, the officers stayed safe, and that things didn't escalate. And quite honestly, that those two groups would start working together to eliminate this criminal element that was threatening to hijack and take over the movement. Third question, Chief, you want to take?
Absolutely, Mayor. Thank you. Kevin, thank you for the question. This is really the question of the day. The heartbreaking realization that people are afraid when their children leave the house and may have an interaction with the police. During my retreat this month, well, it was actually in May 6th, 7th, 8th, and 11th, I opened the retreat with a theme. The theme was relational policing. And I started also with a quote from Einstein, that we cannot solve today's problems using the same thinking we used when we created them. So I challenged my staff to take the vision I was laying out, the matrix report and the Mayor's Commission recommendations, to make substantive change, to focus on youth services, victim services, community services, things like the mobile clue that the Police Foundation is working with us on, and TAPS programs and citizen police academies, and ways to interact, engage, and create positive interactions with our youth. And during those interactions and conversation with our youth, have those tough conversations about how we both can interact together and still, both of us, police and the public, be safe, because there's a lot of uncertainties out there. There's a lot of unknown what is in somebody's mind or heart, and that puts everybody uneasy feeling. So having these conversations, building relational policing, is exactly how we're going to solve this problem in our community.
Everybody for joining us this morning. I know we'll be doing more briefings in the future, and we'll make sure that information gets shared through Robin and the rest of the communications team here at the city. Have a great day, everybody.